Well, as we told you earlier on, today we are looking at the mortgages and how to get yourself a mortgage. And let's go to our big picture tonight. And currently in Kenya, total number of mortgages are 21,900. Employed Kenyans are 14 million, and we have standard mortgage rates that are going for 18%. So all these people are going out there trying to get themselves a place to live, a decent place to live that they call their own. Now, this is how it runs down. If you get a loan, a mortgage for 2 million, monthly you'll be paying 32,208, and then again the total amount will be 5.7 million. Well, if you get yourself a mortgage for 5 million, you'll be paying a monthly payment of 80,521. Total will be 14.49 million. That is after 15 years. And if you get yourself 10 million worth of mortgage, you will get, you'll be paying 161,042 shillings per month. By the end of it all, after 15 years, you have paid 28.9 million. And if you get a mortgage for 12 million, you will be paying 193,250 shillings. At the end of it all, you have paid 34.7 million. Exactly, you can see all the numbers there. We break them down. Remember, this goes for 15 years. This is for 15 years, and it tells you exactly how much you will have paid at the end of 15 years. If you take 2 million, you will have paid 5.7 million. And if you will have taken 5 million, you will have paid 14.49 million in 15 years. If you take mortgage for 10 million, you will have paid 28.9 million at the end of 15 years. And if you take 12 million worth of mortgage, you will have paid 34.7 million. And Terian Chibet is now talking to our panelists tonight. Terian, this actually makes me wonder, do I need it? I mean, you look at after 15 years, you pay for about what? Some 28 million.
You know, I was just asking George here, because when we were doing these calculations earlier, I was like, there's something wrong with my calculator. Yeah. You know, and we went to different housing agencies just to find out how they're coming up with those rates. And George just told me, yes, it's true. Anyway, just before we get into our discussion with my panelists tonight, let's look at a story done by Bella Genga. Is this your year to own a home? Home ownership has for long, of course, been considered the ideal status symbol. And one way of achieving this status symbol is by acquiring a mortgage. And of course, there are other means such as buying a plot and developing your own home, getting a prefabricated house, and other options that our panelists will tell us. But first, let's look at the big picture brought to us by Bella Genga.
Owning a home is almost every person's dream, and over the last few years, urban areas in Kenya have become a construction ground, literally, with developments littering most places. At lending rates of between 9 to 15%, for some it was manageable, but 3 years ago, interest rates rose to 25%.
In time, the lending rate stabilized, and the key lender to banks, the central bank, also lowered its lending rate to 8.5%. Now, borrowers thought that the banks would follow suit.
Today, taking a mortgage will slap you an interest rate of at least 16.9%, double the rate the banks borrow from the Central Bank of Kenya.
At 17% or 15 to 17% margin, I mean, kind of a range is too high for mortgages. An interest rate between 12.5% and 15% for a mortgage in Kenya is modest.
The high interest rates and lack of regulation in the pricing structure of homes have turned the mortgage industry into a jungle where only the rich survive. For instance, for a 3-bedroom apartment in Kileleshwa that will cost you 13 million shillings at an interest rate of 17%, you will pay at least 190,000 shillings per month for 20 years and a whopping 45 million shillings over the 20-year period. This is about 32 million shillings more than the original cost of the house. With only 100,000 Kenyans earning above 400,000 shillings, millions are locked out of the mortgage market.
Rent is an expense. And if you begin paying rent and pay it for 15 years, you will have helped somebody else buy their house while you own nothing. So at the end of the day, if you ask me, it's a lose win rather than a win-win situation.
But for a small minority, securing a mortgage is a necessary evil.
Buying a house for us is not something that we are considering as an option, it's something that we have to do. So we decided to have it done this early so that we can, take up future projects.
For those tired of paying rent like Julius, financial experts say there is a way around the mortgage trap. This is getting into a long-term mortgage contract and paying it off as quickly as possible with a financier who will not penalize you for clearing your loan early.
Any extra money paid into a mortgage goes directly into reducing the capital and effectively reducing the interest.
Meanwhile, potential homeowners are keen on finding other affordable options.
You still want to go for your small plot and then build your one room, move in, like that. But we also use the off plan, where you buy a house 6 months before completion.
In the developed world, like the United States, the government actually subsidizes mortgage rates so that more and more people can afford homes. Back here, experts say a similar move is what will finally enable more Kenyans to afford homes. Bella Genga for Citizen Business Center.
Now, of course, after that report by Bella Genga, there's many questions that we are asking. And who better to tell us this than our panelists tonight? Joining us, George Adulu, Head of Mortgage at Jamii Bora Bank. Tonight, you're the financier. Wachira Njuguna, I beg your pardon, the MD of National Housing Corporation. Today, you represent the government and, of course, the body that's in charge of providing housing, affordable housing, to Kenyans. And Njoroge Nganga, head of Home Africa, and tonight you are the developer. So you'll be telling us all these questions. I mean, you'll be answering these questions that Kenyans are asking about how they can be able to afford a home. And 40 million people in this country, 14 million of them are working, 20,000 mortgages. George, what's going on?
In my opinion, the answer to that question is as simple as it can be. Housing is very expensive, and before we even look at the interest rates, the other things that make the overall cost of housing to be expensive. For example, before the house is sold at 5 million, there's the cost of land that you have to look at. There's the construction cost. The developer is here himself. He'll tell us how expensive it is to build these houses. And therefore, while the developer would like to build the house, to sell a house at 2 million, the overall cost of constructing the house may not allow him to do that. And therefore, it's not just interest rate. There are other things that come into play to affect the cost of the house.
Okay, that's very true. Njuguna?
Well, mortgages. I think that there are many alternative ways of accessing housing, and the way of the mortgage is just one way, and all the other 40 million Kenyans are housed in one way or the other, and they have alternative ways of accessing mortgage. Of course, what everyone is looking for is the best option.
Yes.
If what is available now in the standard mortgage system is unaffordable, is expensive, is inaccessible, then obviously one would be tempted to look for an alternative way of financing housing. And that is what all the other 40 million minus the 20,000 Kenyans are pursuing. And the only other alternative solution they have is through the National Housing Corporation.
Of course, we have given you all the time to speak well about National Housing Corporation. I know we'll get into the finer details, of that. And some people say that government has actually, ducked its role in providing affordable housing to Kenyans. But we will get back to that, Mr. Ashir. Njoroge, you're a developer. Why such huge disparities? Why can't 40 million people be able to own their own homes?
I think, the numbers speak for themselves, and it's focus. I think government needs to focus. There needs to be focus on funding the sector, by government. There needs to be affordable financing to that sector, long-term financing, because some of the financing that's going into the sector is actually short-term. And, my colleague here will tell you that, a lot of the money that he lends for mortgages on a short-term basis. So I think it's focus. The government needs to, in a sense, begin looking at uncrowding itself, less borrowing from the banks to allow the banks to then lend out to mortgage takers. And at the same time, provide, enabling environment for infrastructure, for instance, roads. If you can open up areas outside of Nairobi, decongest the areas, develop on cheaper land. And as a developer and as Home Africa, that's what we're looking at doing. You look at all our projects, we look at developing projects outside of Nairobi where the land is at a lower cost. But if we can get assistance, from the county governments, from the central government, and from other agencies to develop the infrastructure, because infrastructure is about 30–40% of the cost of the house, that can lower the cost, the end cost of the house, and there will be a ripple effect of the mortgages. Okay.
George, let's talk about interest, and I'm glad you shot yourself in the foot earlier on when you said the interest rates is rather high, and I hope you can explain to Kenyans why they are that high. But first of all, some say, housing today in Kenya is for the rich. I mean, if you're getting a house at 1 million shillings and you end up paying about 2.7 million shillings for the same house, while, members of parliament are getting mortgage rates of 3%, you work for a bank, bankers are getting it, at 8%? Why are you punishing the rest of us Kenyans?
Okay, there's a reason why the interest rates are where they are right now in the market. And one reason is what Mr. Njoroge mentioned, that the banks right now are relying so much on short-term sources of funding like deposits and the fixed deposits that people put in banks for a short period of time and use that to lend long-term. What that means is that you are getting very expensive sources of income and it becomes very difficult to lend on the long term. An example is that, for example, if you had 10 million right now and you approached most banks, you want to put your money in a fixed deposit, most of the time you probably earn interest of between maybe 8 and 12%. Now, if banks are getting money at such high rates, then it becomes impossible to, to lend at very favorable rates. Because what happens is that after the bank gets money at that rate, you're looking at that cost of financing at almost 10%. Then you need to add administrative expenses. You have employees to take care of. Over and above that, not all the loans that you give will come back. You have to add a risk premium. Then the shareholders who have invested in the bank expect a return. And therefore, you're looking at a margin of almost 10% to meet all those expenses, when in the end the bank is probably making 2 or 3%. And therefore, it's just that the cost of funding for banks is very high, and therefore the cost of loans becomes also high. Now, a mortgage can be very expensive. You've just shown the numbers that you take 2 million, end up paying 5 million. To me, that can be managed. An example is that if you're to take a loan for 25 years or 20 years or 15 years, and you pay within a short period of time, the tip I'll give tonight is that if you look at a loan repayment schedule and you make any lump sum payments within the first 3 years, what that does is that it saves you, for every shilling of lump sum payment you make within the first 3 years, saves you 3 shillings in interest. And therefore, if you have a mortgage that's running for 15 years, you get 100,000 or 10,000 or a million, use that to reduce your principal, and the net effect that you are saving yourself 3 shillings for every 1 shilling that you are putting in as lump sum payment. Therefore, to me, you can manage the cost, the overall cost of that mortgage. You know what worries me is data released by the government and other private sector players. In the number of people that are employed, out of those 14 million people that are employed, only 50,000 of them earn above, I think, 50,000 shillings, and then only 400,000 and above 50,000 shillings, and only 100,000, I can't remember the exact figure, but a very small number actually earn above 100,000 shillings. So who's taking these mortgages? And how can we pay 193,000 each month for 3 years? I'll take the blame to the government, for the simple reason that, like you said, the overall cost of a house, there are 3 key things that go in. Number one, the cost of land. Cost of land is subject to location. The developer mentioned that, cost of services, infrastructure. For any development, he'll tell you he'll spend almost 30 to 40, maybe 20 to 30% just providing infrastructure if the government had not done that. Now you can imagine if that is done, then you're already looking at a saving of almost 30% on the overall cost of the house.
Yes.
Number two, there's the cost, the actual cost of construction, you know, and that's affected by so many things, you know, the transport costs, you know, the cost of the materials, energy, and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. Now, over and above that, add in the cost of professionals. Now, those two key components mean that a house is already expensive.
Yes.
What we need to see more is the government, you know, coming in to create, number one, an enabling environment that will enable houses to be, you know, the overall cost of delivering a house to be lower. Mm-hmm. Number two, which NHC is already leading the way, and I'm very happy about that. We need to start interrogating alternative building technologies, because who said a house has to be a stone?
Yeah, nyumba ni mawe.
The others, you know, you know, it can be glass, it can be anything else.
Prefabricated, yeah. It can be anything
And therefore,
else.
for me, if that is done, then a house that ordinarily would cost 4 million or 5 million using the conventional methods is developed using alternative building technologies, which are cheaper, because this has happened in other countries. The same house could be delivered maybe at 2 million. And therefore,
perhaps, perhaps there's also a great need for perceptions to change, because where I grew up, and I grew up in the village, you know, if somebody came from Nairobi and built a house, you say, umeona nani amejenga nyumba ya mawe, because, you know, that was the thing to get. And Wachira, that brings us to you, of course. You're the man in charge of bringing affordable homes to Kenyans. How can we access, you know, what you have, given the fact that in the past NHC has also been blamed for not actually providing affordable homes to Kenyans?
Thank you, Terian. And I think it needs to be very clear that the government is not to blame for the high mortgage rates.
Okay.
The issuers of those mortgages are perfectly in the center of that blame, because they cannot control their grid, they cannot control their expenses.
The banks?
The banks, that's what I mean.
Do you agree?
You've had every other time His Excellency the President persuading these banks, requesting these banks, begging these banks to reduce, to lower their cost of financing, so that Kenyans can be able to access capital to do business, money to pay for their mortgages. But the lenders are not playing ball. They actually need to come out strongly and support the Jubilee government. Yeah.
So we said we're giving politics a rest today.
so that we are able to bridge the 250,000 housing deficit in the country.
Yes. And
National Housing Corporation is at the forefront. Look at it like this. In Kenya, the lowest mortgage rates are offered by National Housing Corporation.
At what percent is it? At
13%.
13%.
Over the last 50 years, we have built approximately 50,000 houses.
Are you subsidized by the government?
No, this is actually a commercial enterprise, only owned by government. And we are still able to make profits. National Housing Corporation is the biggest real estate company in East Africa by assets and by profitability. And we are still able to give very, very decent and affordable housing to Kenyans.
Tell us about some of those houses.
Interest rates.
Tell us about some of those houses, just to keep our audience aware that if you see this property, it has been developed by National Housing. And if there are any openings, where do they go? Where can they find information on where to get these houses?
Thank you. Over the last 50 years, from Kisumu to Mombasa, in all towns in this country, National Housing Corporation has a footprint. The cheapest, the most affordable houses have been built by National Housing Corporation. It is no wonder that most people actually who've lived in urban centers have all lived in National Housing Corporation houses. Currently, we want to upscale production, because 50,000 houses over the last 50 years is too low, considering the housing need of the country.
Just before you go on, I want to take us back in history to, say, the 80s, when, you know, there is a common consensus that is when the government absconded in its duty to provide housing to Kenyans. Let's look at, for instance, Kimathi, Jericho, and those estates. Apparently, you know, the World Bank came in and said the government should not participate in the development of houses. And the private sector clearly took on and left the government, you know, cowering away. So, you know, how can the government come back and take its role and actually even perhaps put a social angle towards home ownership, because it is a human right. even in our constitution, it is a right to own a home. Can we go back to building the Kimathis and the Jerichos for, you know, the middle class to be able to, and the low, you know, the lower class to actually be able to afford a home finally?
Oh yes, as you've rightly put it, in the Constitution, it's now a basic right. Housing is a basic right. Under the Ministry of Housing, we are developing a housing bill that will be able to regulate the building industry, the real estate industry, be able to create a housing fund that will provide long-term funds for housing, for developing long-term projects under housing. With that, with a housing fund that will provide affordable funds, then we'll be able to develop very, very affordable housing units for Kenyan. But meanwhile, we are rolling out 30,000 units that are very affordable. We want to bring down, as National Housing Corporation, the cost of housing to at least a maximum of $1 million.
Where are these 30,000 units?
We are rolling out projects from Kisumu, Kanyakwar. We are doing 1,200 houses in Kisumu, Kanyakwar. Very decent and affordable, and easily
at 1 million shillings per house.
From 1 million to around 3 million.
Okay, at 13% interest rate.
At 13% interest rates, and I'll be able to tell you how we'll be able to achieve that.
Okay.
Nairobi, we are doing the same thing. Changamwe, we are doing the same thing. We have a partnership with all the counties that we are trying to nurture, so that they bring in their land and we bring in our experience, because we've got a big pool of highly professional people in National Housing Corporation that out of their efficiency, they're also able to bring down the cost of construction. And that benefit goes down to the local Kenyan.
Okay, let's drop in Njoroge into this conversation. Don't smile at these two gentlemen; they are not on your side. They say the developers are actually, you know, causing quite a bit to the high cost of housing. Why are houses so expensive? From a developer's point of view, what options do I have in owning a home that is not as expensive as what we have seen today? You know, what is the cheaper way out?
Well, I think the issue of the issue of the lower cost of the mortgage, I think again goes back to two issues. I think one of that was raised by George. My neighbor here talks about the government not being responsible. They are hugely responsible, because being one of the major borrowers of funds, you know, for instance, pension funds that are the major deposits in banks, they crowd out, you know, the private sector. Now, I know the government is now making effort to go out there and borrow internationally. I think that is a beginning of a good thing to come, because there will be a lot more money internally in the country, and the banks will be able to lend that. And I hope and pray that they actually follow suit and not look at increasing their margins, look at decreasing their margins and making the mortgages you know, affordable, and increasing on volume as opposed to, you know, increasing on the margins. But at the end of the day, I think people have many options. You know, you talk about the 40 million, only 20,000, you know, odd mortgages. Obviously, people live somewhere. The problem is that they don't live in shelter that is appropriate. Now, the question is, who is to blame for that, and who's responsible for making sure that everybody lives lives in shelter that is appropriate for them, given their income level?
I'm curious though. How do you, as a developer, determine the price of a house, and why is it cheaper for me to buy a plot in Kitengela, for instance, and bring up my own house?
Well, obviously, you know, you can own your own house. You can go and buy a plot, but you know, the thing about it is, from the time you buy the plot and start throwing bricks and buying a bag of cement at a time and that sort of thing.
Or a prefab at 1 million, Bob?
You see, the technology rests with some of the other people who are around this table. So if you don't own the technology, you know, it may not be easy for you to access it. So what you're left with is a traditional method. So you go, you know, buy bricks, buy some mortar, get some cement and throw it on the ground. Now, how long will it take you? Now, that's why people normally go for mortgages, because mortgages gives you a much quicker opportunity to put the house up. But you know, then you get faced with the high rates, and obviously, if you live in Kitengela and you work in town, you're not as close as you want to be to your work, you know, place of work. So you have transport costs to factor in, and all that. I think everybody has to come in. The government needs to come in, spread out the infrastructure. We talked about that before. We have to start decongesting Nairobi. And everybody needs to be part of that game. The government, other agencies, the counties, putting in infrastructure, roads, rail, lowering the cost of living out there. And on land that is much cheaper than what we have in the CBD. CBD really is completely out of reach. So at Home Africa, what we're trying to do, a project that we're coming up with in Athi River on 1,000 acres, it'll be out of Nairobi, you know, land that is affordable. We are also looking at bringing in, you know, very good technology to lower the cost of the house. We had a competition recently. We had people from the university who actually came up with a 1 million shilling house. Now that is something that will be accessible. And then we can tier it such that, you know, those who can afford a more expensive house get something bigger, and, you know, that can be structured in such a way that if you want to say a 2-3 bedroom house that is a little more expensive, say about 3 million shillings, you know, then you can still be able to live in one. But everybody needs to get into this game. Government is borrowing so much money from the banking sector. They need to put infrastructure. They need to work with other agencies in order to put these, you know, PPPs together. And then everybody comes into the game.
Let me just wind up very quickly with you, Ashir, and we cannot close before I ask you this, because it was said in Vision 2030, at least in the blueprint, that National Housing Corporation, at least it was a proposal that could be turned into a fund, and perhaps, you know, introduce a model that, in my opinion, looked like something like the Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae system, where the government could actually come in and subsidize mortgage rates. So maybe we'll be as lucky as the bankers and the MPs at 3%. Is that still in the plan?
Yes, it's, we still have a plan to set up a secondary mortgages market as a National Housing Corporation. We are still looking at the possibility, of course, of the housing fund that is supposed to be put in place to be able to fund social and public housing and any other housing. But in the short run, to be able to tame the wayward mortgage market, we as National Housing Corporation, with the support of the government, we are rolling out a housing bond that will at least attract funds, long-term funds, at very, very low interest rates. And with that money at National Housing Corporation, we'll be able to fund massive rollout of projects cheaply and decent, and enable all Kenyans to be able to access housing. Thank
you very much. We will come back later, because there's some envelopes behind me here that all of you gentlemen have to pick and tell me. We've got some interesting questions for you, and you know, it would be good to have a laugh after that discussion. So I'll hand you now over to Michael Njenga to bring you what's coming up next. Well, thank you very much, Terry and Chebet. Quite an interesting debate there about the mortgages. Of course, there's more fun at the end, as Terry said.